Yeah. Yeah, speaking of the book, I really like the way it's laid out here. You have, and we talked about this when we were going through it, but you have kind of the claims that are addressed, and you kind of address them, and then at the end you have these discussion questions, and then as you mentioned earlier, you have the back of the book where everything is kind of summarized with this question and answer format. So what were you trying to accomplish here with this kind of format?
Well, we realized college students are busy. And, sometimes just a matter of he has some of those zingers or some of those one-liners. And, they can be very devastating if somebody just, it creates doubt in the heart. And if they don't have a compelling answer to that, or they don't even realize there are compelling answers, they may just swallow that, just hook, line, and sinker. And so we felt, well, we needed to have some sort of a tool where ideally people will read the whole book, right? But in case they don't, at least we give them a quick resource, some sort of a primer where they kind of Cliff's Notes, right? Where they can look up, one of the things that he keeps repeating ad nauseum almost at some of those interviews, and and then say, okay, yeah, there are answers. And I think part of it is he makes it look like that any intelligent person would agree with him, and so we got 4 PhDs among the 3 of us, right? And so I remember my daughter, the one that enrolled there at UNC, she said, so Dad, you wrote the book just basically to make the point that intelligent people can believe the Bible, right? And I said, yeah, essentially that's right, because he almost makes it look like you have to be a simpleton or a country bumpkin, right? Or super gullible. In some of my teaching, and I've taught some of this in Sunday school classes or at conferences, I talk to people about a spectrum, that you have, on the one hand, you have extreme skepticism. And on the other hand, you have extreme naivete, or, people who believe everything. And he makes it almost look like those are the only 2 options, when of course there aren't, right? I mean, on the one side, from extreme skepticism, there would be doubt, right? Doubt is different, I think, because doubt is open to evidence, but hardened skepticism basically raises the bar so high that you can never satisfy a hardened skeptic with evidence. And on the other side, there's not only this naive gullibility that believes anything, there's also discerning engagement. And so I think that is what we are trying to cultivate, especially with college students, to say, yeah, you have questions, that's fine. Let's look at the issue, not in a simplistic way, because when you look at Ehrman's works closely, often he's the one who's very simplistic in the way he deals with a given issue. In many ways, he's just one of those historical critics, kind of like remember the Jesus seminar, or, people who just already start out with this skepticism toward the resurrection, or they published the book, The 5 Gospels, and so they put in red what they thought Jesus said, and there's almost nothing is in red.
Our little pebbles that we put into a fishbowl. Yeah,
yeah, that's right.
Yeah, we talked about that when we covered Mitch Stokes' book, How to Be an Atheist, how skeptics aren't skeptical enough, taking their own claims and applying it to themselves, and showing that, hey, be skeptical, but then actually be skeptical. So that speaks well to our continuing conversation. And as a video editor as well, who cuts up our episodes and makes little short clips for people to kind of devour, I appreciate how the book is laid out too, because it really helps. In fact, I had one a tweet. Someone responded, I think 3 weeks after we covered. There's an example in your book where Ehrman kind of claimed that the return of Jesus in I believe 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are contradictory, because one says this will come quickly, and the other one says this comes first, and there's this contradiction. I was like, well, that's what the video is about. Did you click on the link? No, I didn't click on the link. I just know that it's wrong. Like, just because something happens first doesn't mean that something also can't happen quickly. And it seems like once you break it down and kind of get past the rhetoric and lay out what you've done in the book, you can actually see what the claim is and then see the responses. And I think too,
and different people have different issues, and so it's the kind of book where people can jump around. They can go straight to whichever chapter, they're most interested in. And then you just try to be clear in what you cover in a given chapter. And then, like you said, Tony, break it down into maybe a few specific maybe claims Ehrman makes or questions he raises, and then address it directly. We just felt like, okay, he doesn't invite us to his New Testament survey classes, but this is something we can put into the hands of hopefully many of his students, where he makes those claims. And so here are our answers for those who do want to know the other side, because he doesn't even acknowledge that all the issues he raises, scholars have addressed.
I think that's one of the hindrances we have in the church today is not being proud of our history. We have 2,000 years of church history, and it seems like we have this idea that starting from 1952 with the invention of like the photocopier, that's when true scholarship started. We didn't know anything before then. It was just people that were attributing lightning to God bowling type deal. But if you think about it, we as a collective have been writing books against claims against heresies and the like under persecution, under political strife. I mean, we've had to deal with the Romans, the Muslims, the Roman Catholics, the rise and continuation of the Reformation, and then the 20th century with the academia coming in and becoming liberal, and then If you think that you have something new, it's probably heresy. That's the joke. But it seems like if you're writing something about the Christian tradition, there's probably somebody within that span of 2,000 years that has at least touched on it and talked about why there might be these differences in responding to it.
Yeah, that's true. C.S. Lewis called that, as you know, chronological snobbery. That. Critical scholars today, say they know the truth better than those who are much closer to the time. And so, I deal with that quite a bit in my own writing, that, people find that just because an article is 5 or 10 years old, it's irrelevant. And somehow if an article was written like this year or last year, it's more accurate, and that's demonstrably false.
Yeah. Let's move on to Walter Bauer. I'm kind of curious about this. How did his theory become so known to someone like Ehrman to kind of make it popular? Why does it still hang around? We outside the show read your and Michael J. Kruger, who I probably refer to you and Michael J. Kruger more than anything else. I did a clip show where I cut every time I said your guys' name. How often that happens. But you did a Heresy of Orthodoxy, which is, I think, just a brilliant book. I mean, it covers absolutely everything. And the thing that I like with you and Kruger is that you give the other side the respect that it deserves, to even say, hey, you have a place at the table just as much as we do. We're going to kind of destroy your argument, but here's where the good things that you bring in to talk about, and then what Michael J. Kruger has done with his other book of looking at the second century and looking how much strife there is within there. Can you kind of talk about Bauer and kind of why he still remains?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. That's Ehrman actually really is he's aware of some of the weaknesses of that theory. I'll explain in a minute. But so in the Heresy of Orthodoxy, we actually call it the Bauer-Ehrman thesis, because Ehrman has essentially bought into it incredibly, because he acknowledges that it's very flawed. And I think we have our kind of a sneaking suspicion why. But yeah, so this is something that I contributed to the book. Naturally, I German background, and so I was just kind of fascinated. Walter Bauer is primarily actually known as a Greek scholar, right, for that famous Bauer lexicon. So this is almost like he was moonlighting when he wrote the other book, right? That the so-called Bauer thesis is based on. But essentially, as you know, very simple to explain. He says, in the beginning, Christianity was diverse, and only later kind of coalesced in what we today know as the Christian faith. In other words, in the first and early second century, Bauer claims there was no such thing as orthodoxy or right belief. There were only multiple Christianities in the plural. And as a result, Ehrman wrote books, Lost Christianities, The Lost Scriptures. You can already tell, right, by those book titles that, I mean, he's a complete Bauerite. And so he says those Christianities in the plural could all equally stake the claim of being Christianity. There was no kind of standardization in the first century. And I think you can see how that appeals to people today because, today is all about, pluralism and tolerance. And so someone like Bart Ehrman, who teaches at UNC Chapel Hill, I've been to some of those parent orientations and, and student welcomes at UNC. And clearly that's a core value, diversity. And so he uses that to basically debunk the truthfulness of the Bible and its claims regarding Jesus as being the only way and Jesus being God. So he calls the writers of Scripture proto-Orthodox, and he says it was only the Roman Church later on that used its clout to decree what Christians were to believe, and then they branded everything else as heretical. So you and I, right? Basically, our forebears are really those intolerant, people who just brutally oppress the opposition. It's really a rather cynical view because it says there's no such thing as absolute truth. All truth is relative, and it's simply a matter of what the powerful impose on others. So I think that's why Bauer's theory still hangs around. It resonates with, and that's the subtitle of Heresy of Orthodoxy, with our contemporary culture's fascination with diversity and imposes it onto first century Christianity. The funny thing is that even though Bauer's book is called Heresy and Orthodoxy in earliest Christianity, it was first published in 1934, by the way, for our listeners, but not translated into English in 1971. Right. He never studied the first century. So he calls his book Earliest Christianity. I mean, it's outright deceptive. The title is deceptive. What he does is essentially study Christianity in the second century in four major cities, such as, Ephesus or Antioch. So his claim that he studied earliest Christianity is bogus. It's patently false because what we actually find when we do look at the first century evidence, which is what we do in our book, both in Truth and the Culture of Doubt and in Heresy of Orthodoxy, what we find is there was a very strong definition of apostolic teaching and the gospel, and people who taught contrary to that were denounced by the first Christians like Paul or Peter in the strongest terms possible. Just think the first letter Paul wrote in our New Testament, Galatians chapter 1, where he says, if anyone teaches a gospel other than the one I taught, let him be accursed.
Yeah. It seems there where he's writing to people who he almost seems warning to his audience of, hey, there might be these letters that are floating around that I haven't written or authorized to write. And It seems like it's not like he got bonked on the head and will suddenly become a Gnostic. It seems like he's saying, listen, if this comes from Paul the Apostle, and it says, Jesus didn't have a bodily form, throw that out. That's anathema. It's damned heresy. It seems like even what you're talking about, Galatians 1, is shedding an important light on the written aspect of our tradition, and this idea of it was only an oral tradition that was later passed on. It seems we have an earlier attestation of evidence for the importance of the written gospel aspect.
Yeah, and so the dates, when you look at Galatians, we're talking about the early 50s AD, so that's a lot earlier than those Gnostic writings, certainly middle of the first century. You think of Acts 2:42, the early church was devoted, very strong word, devoted to the apostles' teaching. Again, we're talking about literally, right? I mean, weeks after the resurrection, First Corinthians, the famous articulation of the gospel there in First Corinthians 15, and is also written in the mid 50s. And so we're talking about very, very early on. We find the church completely rallying around the gospel, and the reason for that, I think, is in part because it is basically it's already taught in the Old Testament. In Romans 1, Paul says it's the gospel of God who was promised beforehand in the law and the prophets. This is not even a New Testament innovation. It's basically an application of Old Testament teaching, in light of the fact that Jesus has now come, the Messiah has now come. And when you look at the Gnostic writings, there's not a reference to the Old Testament. Gnostics had no use for the Old Testament whatsoever. And so that's how you can immediately tell if your writing is Christian or Gnostic. Is there a building on the Old Testament?
And so you think that Bauer then gets his clearly, as you've demonstrated here, he didn't look in the earliest Christianity in the first century.
Yeah, that's a great point, Tony. He just didn't look early enough. Inexplicably, right? As a scholar, would you not want to get to the root of the issue? And clearly Christianity started in the 30s AD. Yeah. Why not look there? I think, he was more of maybe a little bit more of an academic scholar that just did that study, and which he thought would be interesting to go to those cities and to see, hey, were there more Christians or were there more heretics? But even that already presupposes that, how to distinguish between the two. Yeah. But he, like you said, I think that is his problem from a scholarly perspective. As a result, Tony, there have been some devastating critiques of Bauer. So we're not the first ones to critique. Fortunately, we could build on the work of others. Yeah. The amazing thing is, Patrick, as you mentioned, that somehow that Bauer thesis still sticks around, even though it's been just soundly refuted as, being really, flawed to the point of being fatally flawed.
I think when we read Heresy of Orthodoxy, I blamed it on the Nazis because we couldn't get it over here and translated and respond to it quick enough so that it would die a natural death of just being an odd placeholder. Someone's going to quote it in their dissertation, and it'll just be so that they have another point in the dissertation. Now we have popular writings that we have to work around.